Hello and welcome to Nonny, Yanga's flagship talk show where we discuss all the hot topics. Today we're celebrating our black servicemen and women who fought in the war. 2018 marks 100 years since the end of World War I, and as we enter into Black History Month, what better time to celebrate those that gave their life to serve this country? Joining me today, actor Nicholas Bailey, community psychiatric nurse Sandra Montgomery Sinclair, and ex-soldier Mark Johnson. Welcome guys, nice to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. From Black Britons who lived in the UK to Africans and Caribbeans who travelled here to support the fight for freedom. During the First and Second World Wars, thousands of black recruits fought in all branches of the armed forces. Today, however, these efforts are barely recognised. One of the few exceptions is Walter Tull, who has become the most celebrated black British soldier of the First World War. Walter joined the war in 1914, becoming the first black officer in the British Army. Although books and documentaries have secured Walter's place in British history, his story did not exist in isolation. Why is it so important to celebrate black people's efforts in the war? This is a really important conversation. And Nicholas, people may recognise you, not for talking about this topic, but tell us about Walter Tull and why his story should be celebrated.
Well, Walter Tull was a pioneer, a hero, in the most British of senses. He was born in 1888 in Folkestone to a Bajan father and a mother, a local girl from Folkestone. And he was orphaned before the age of 10, wow. Ended up at what became the National Children's Home. And swiftly then became the first, I believe, he was the first black player to play for Tottenham Hotspur football team as a professional.
He's multi-talented.
Multi-talented, yeah. He qualified as an apprentice printer. And later on, he enlisted in 1914, one of the first sportsmen to do so. And he became the first mixed heritage officer in the British Army in 1917.
Wow.
And he gave his life 100 years ago this year. In the Second Battle of the Somme, the Kaiser's Push, on the 25th of March. So he's a huge hero. He's been a huge inspiration to me. And finally, his legacy is assured. A historian by the name of Phil Vasili was instrumental in sort of giving us back the story of Walter. And it's been a real privilege for me to be involved as a presenter in the documentary Walter Tull, Forgotten Hero, and now in my efforts with Combat Stress and Spartan Races UK.
We're keeping his story alive, and
Absolutely.
I'm so glad that you guys are here to talk about this. Mark, most of our viewers, just like me, never have heard of Walter Tull. Why?
It's really interesting. The same story is repeated with others serving in the First World War and in the Second World War. And as soon as the conflicts come towards an end, there are almost immediate efforts to erase the story of ethnic minorities from the record in a very active way. So memos being sent out saying, we will no longer recruit any black officers in the Air Force as of this date because we don't want black or coloured aircrew in the mess after the war is over. So the films don't mention them, the books don't mention them. So I'm not sure if there's a strategy behind that. But
there must be. Clearly, there's something.
I think there's a cultural leaning towards that.
There is, isn't there? And Sandra, do you see it with kids today? They just feel completely disconnected. And even me, you know, I've got children, and you know, when they're at school, and you know, it comes to wearing a poppy and stuff, I tell them that it's the right thing to do. But you do find that sometimes there is a disconnection between black people in Britain and the war, and there shouldn't be.
No, absolutely not. I work for Combat Stress and I'm a community psychiatric nurse, and I see veterans on a daily basis, and I can honestly say that the veterans that I see very few from the ethnic minority groups.
Why?
I think there's this stigma among black people to come forward when they're suffering with mental health.
Yes.
It goes back to their upbringing, you know, generations from generations. It's something that I think us as black people, they tend to deal with themselves within the
You're
family.
right, and I do want to, we're going to talk about that more after the break. Thinking about Nicholas and the disconnect between blacks and the war.
Yeah.
Do black people in Britain just not like war?
just not like war.
Yes, as in, you know, the kind of connection between war, you kind of feel like, you know, Britain have done so many bad things, I want to be disconnected. Or is it because of this erasing in schools of the curriculum?
Well, I think, you know, it's the sin of omission, really. I think I sort of agree that there has been this sort of expungement of black narratives from British history in general. I was a historian growing up.
Wow.
As a child, history was my best
As well
subject.
as a good actor.
Well, that's a matter of opinion. But yeah, I absolutely. We studied hardly anything about black history. You know, and,
It was the Arawaks, wasn't it? And slavery.
Yeah, bits and
That was
pieces,
about it.
slavery, but always in the empire context, always in the white British context. But I didn't know there were these narratives. It's later on, and in the household and on my mother's knee, so to speak, where I found out that there have been black people here for 2,000 years. That there were black sailors who fought in the Napoleonic Wars. That there were black airmen and other service personnel in both world wars who gave their lives, including Walter, for a country that wasn't really ready for them, didn't want them to participate. And Walter came up against this. The Manual of Military Law in 1914 stated that black people were to be discouraged because they thought that they'd lead mutinies against their white NCOs, and they didn't want them to bear arms and kill white soldiers, even if they were the enemy.
Gosh, that's just, it's
So-
absolutely, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? Whose responsibility is it then to tell these stories? Mark, talk to us a little bit about your uncle and, you know, what he provided to the World War II.
So my uncle, the thing that interests me most about him, he was one of 400 black Caribbean volunteers who flew as aircrew over Europe. So
Wow.
not carrying boxes, not loading airplanes, but flying. He was a navigator, he was an officer. There were pilots, there were Spitfire pilots, black West Indians and West African. What motivated them? That's the key, because they tend to be branded as Uncle Toms. And I think a lot of the resistance that the generation today has towards service, if you will, comes from the sense that they're supporting a system they don't believe in.
Yes, yes.
So
You
why
find
did
that in
they
the
fight?
Islamic community
Yes,
as well.
very much so. So why did they fight? Well, he expressed it very clearly. He said, look, we were in Jamaica. We had submarines around us in the sea. There were 22 German submarines operating in the Caribbean. We knew that if Hitler defeated England or Britain, then he would
He'll
come
be
to the
coming for
colonies
us, yeah.
and we would return to slavery.
Wow.
So colonial rule was bad, but it wasn't nearly as bad as Nazi
Hitler.
rule would have been. And therefore we fought for ourselves. And we fought on the basis that if we demonstrated our abilities and our willingness to fight tyranny, we could not be denied independence thereafter. And many of the people who flew and fought on the ground and sailed became quite active in the independence movements. One of them even became the Prime Minister of Barbados.
Gosh, wow, it's such a fascinating story. One we will continue after the break. Still to come, we discuss whether enough is being done to educate people on the contributions of black soldiers in the war, and we look at the help and support veterans have when they return home. See you after the break. Welcome back to Nonny. Now, Black History Month was introduced to the UK 40 years ago. The motive behind this was to readdress the way history was taught in British schools. Black contribution to society was often airbrushed out of the curriculum. Black veterans have spoken out about the lack of education and recognition for their contribution in the world wars. Is enough being done to educate people about our contribution? I presume the answer is going to be a resounding no. But again, I asked this before the break. Who's responsible for this?
Well, obviously, the education system. I mean, I work and have worked as a teacher. I've taught a lot of young children. I've worked with children across the curriculum in the subjects of drama and English. And what I find is a lot of children now, they don't see themselves on screen. They don't see themselves in the history books. They disengage. It's purely an academic exercise interacting with this. And I think it is. They say that history is written by the victors, and I think that's very much the case, but it's done at source. Walter's story was always there. His family knew about him, but it wasn't until the 1990s when Phil Vasili and myself got involved. Nobody else had heard of Walter. And the efforts of people over time have really taken that forward. But I have to say that it is also a collective responsibility, and down to the point that was being made about black identity. A lot of young people don't realise that there is a Black British context.
Of course.
So they see themselves and they see them not being represented in the mainstream. So they say, well, that's not for me, until they connect with it. And the resources are out there, but I think Black history should be part of British history. We shouldn't need Black History Month.
Yeah,
Black history should just be every month. It should be all the time, all around us. Yeah. So I have to explain to a lot of people why I believe that this should be the case. And I really do believe, as somebody who's into my history, that we shouldn't have to tune into a David Olusoga documentary. We shouldn't have to go into the depths of... Who's great, by the way,
because we do love him.
He is great. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, we want the Black stories, social and political and military, in the main, so that our heroes, and I'm talking about ordinary heroes here, our heroes become, and their legacies become a part of us, and then we will feel connected to this culture.
You know what, you're right, hallelujah. But, it's fascinating because, I think sometimes some kids might see history as a little bit boring, but these stories are not boring. No. They're exciting. And you're like, gosh, I know that street, or I know that borough, and there was a Black guy there 200 years ago. Is the curriculum and the education system not seeing that this could be a way to draw in those kids that are not engaging in your schools or your lessons?
I think we have a problem on both sides of the coin. When I grew up in Jamaica. I was in the Jamaica Defence Force, and most members of the Jamaica Defence Force are of African descent. And right next door to our drinking club on barracks, there was an ex-servicemen's club, primarily World War II servicemen, and they were all Black West Indian World War II. Wow. And we used to laugh at them. We thought they were pretending. We thought they were,
really?
Had been in secondary roles and were now claiming, some sort of credibility through attending the club. And it's only when I started interviewing people many years later that I discovered these were actual operational aircrew who'd been decorated, who had flown over Europe, some of whom had been shot down and been imprisoned in German camps. Okay? And I knew none of that, didn't know it from them, didn't know it from my peers, and we wouldn't have believed it at the time. So I think we have an image or a minority inferiority complex going on that is also part of the equation. So we're not pulling, and it's not being pushed either.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder caused by very stressful, frightening or distressing events. It was first recognised in war veterans from as early as the 1900s. Combat Stress is the UK's leading charity for veterans' mental health, and in the last 5 years alone they have seen a 70% hike in the number of veterans requiring their help. Men are likely to shy away from asking for help, and it's often overlooked in the Black community. How important is it for us to be educated about PTSD? Sandra, let me come to you first, because this is very, very serious, and whether you're Black, blue, Asian, you've heard about it. Yes. And it's frightening and worrying.
It is very worrying. Guys out there feel that stigma to admit that they may be struggling, that they may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. With a lot of the veterans that I see, it could take many years for them to actually realise that there is a problem and that it could be related back to their past.
What are some of the symptoms?
Some of the symptoms that they experience could be hypervigilance.
Sorry, explain that.
Hypervigilance, where they're very alert of their surroundings. They could be a little bit paranoid. Okay. They're very, aware of everything is heightened. Wow. Their surroundings, everything is very much heightened. They may get intrusive thoughts. They may get flashbacks, situations that they've been in when they've been on tour. They get the flashbacks can happen anytime. They can get nightmares. They can become avoidant, where they isolate from other people.
God, so it just sounds like an absolute horror and a nightmare to be going through.
The list goes on.
So let's talk about the Black men and women that are coming through your doors, and why you think that not enough is being done to kind of encourage them in.
I do believe it's the stigma, admitting that they're struggling, admitting that they could have a mental health problem. I think it is such a stigma among the community.
So it's kind of seen as a sign of weakness, isn't it? Do you think, Nicholas, that there is enough to help with Black men and women that have served in the war and have come back and are suffering at these kind of symptoms?
Well, I think As with anything, a lot of the barriers are things that we experience inside. And certainly when I met veterans in Birmingham at the British Legion, a lot of them were saying, look, I didn't experience PTSD for the first time until 20 years after I left the service. So, and it has so many manifestations. It's a complex issue. And not all of the sufferers of PTSD have it specifically because they were in a firefight, in Fallujah or whatever. But certainly, I think as a community, this is what I hear from Combat Stress, is that there may be false narratives out there and rumors that, okay, I'm an immigrant, I've retired here, I've married an English person, I've settled down, we have children. If I come forward, I may be deported, sent home. There'll be this people think I'm weak, I'll struggle to get work. So there's kind of an umbrella over this, which is, okay, in terms of identity, am I prepared to say, I'm in pain, I'm hurting, I need help, please help, because this is the charity to do it. Almost everybody I've spoken to, I've met several veterans now, has said to me, if it was not for Combat Stress, I would not be here.
Gosh.
And that's not some trumpeted thing. That's just a fact.
No, it clearly is.
And I have to say, from a black perspective, from any perspective, they need to know they can come forward. There are people there who sympathise, empathise, and will help.
Oh, clearly, that's why we're having this conversation. And please do come forward. Mark, what happens if some of these symptoms go untreated and undiagnosed?
Interesting question. When I did my military service a long time ago, there was absolutely nothing done for you, not even a kind word from above. And I lost comrades in horrific circumstances that I won't go into. And you were just expected to man up and carry on. And even today, I think that generation of soldiers, and probably some subsequent generations, we were trained to use scientific means to kill. Okay, and we were dehumanized, and there's a long extended period of training. There's no period at all of reintroduction to society. You're expected to somehow manage that by yourself.
Is that still the case today?
Well, I'm sure they have things in place today, but it's nowhere near as intensive and as drawn out as the original training is. And I'm surprised we don't have more problems, to be honest, because we teach people to kill, we empower them, we provide them with the means and the capability, and then we bring them back into society, and they actually, on the behave themselves.
Can I ask you a personal question, Mark? You said you served in Jamaica.
Yeah, Jamaica and the Caribbean.
And the Caribbean. Do you know if any of your can I call them colleagues? I'm not sure of the correct term, that have suffered from something like PTSD, and it's led to criminality, even murder. That might sound extreme, but possibly not.
I do have a former colleague who was convicted of murder. I don't know if PTSD was a cause or not. The list that Sandra described is very familiar to me, and I think that there are a lot of people who, in fact, some people are boastful of it. They talk about, I'm an ex-soldier, so I can recognize cover when I see it, and I can respond quickly if there's a gunshot, and that's actually a matter of pride, but actually they're suffering.
They're suffering inside. Yeah. Nick, talk to us about your involvement with Combat Stress and also the Spartan race.
Yes. Well, it all sort of started. I was aware that Walter's centenary was coming up, so I reached out to the press office at Combat Stress, and I said, well, let's do something. Let's try and make Walter's legacy of heroism work today, because Walter suffered from PTSD.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He missed the first part of the Battle of the Somme because he was off with shell shock, as they called it then. His whole battalion was decimated, and he came back to the war and served out the rest of it until less than 6 months before the end of the war. So I reached out to Combat Stress. I'd been aware of them for some time and of the work that they do. I thought, well, okay, how can I raise money and awareness when I found out that Black and Asian soldiers were not coming forward? So I reached out to to Spartan Races UK. And I signed up for my first race. I actually have the medal here.
Oh, okay. Is it a gift?
Prepared as I am.
Thank you.
No, you didn't run it. Yeah, but that's the sprint. There were 3 races, and I think the synergies are there, sort of metaphorical and otherwise, because it's a military-style obstacle race, an OCR, obstacle course race. A lot of military personnel take part. And as I went round, I was really moved by the amount of volunteers of the Spartan movement who came forward and said, come on, keep going. Oh, great, they saw my Combat Stress t-shirt. They said, oh, my uncle served, or oh, I ran a Spartan race a few weeks ago. I raised some money. Keep going. You know, great charity. Well done. And I found that the synergies were there because it's about overcoming challenges, overcoming adversity, metaphorically speaking. And it seemed like the perfect fit. So now I'm trying to bring the two organizations together because I'm hooked now. So I'm planning to race in Windsor in a week's time. But I have a niggling injury, so I'm not sure whether I'll be able to do it. But
you can do it.
I can
Think
do
of
it.
all
I
the
can do it.
servicemen and women you're shining a light on. Guys, we've got to wrap up.
Right,
I'm
okay.
so sorry it's so short, but thank you for coming on. This is a really important, fascinating topic. That's it from me, Juliana Olayinka, and my fabulous guests, Nicholas Bailey, Sandra Montgomery Sinclair, and Mark Johnson. Don't forget, guys, Nonny's now online. Wherever you are in the world, go to www.yangatv.com to check out every single episode. Join me next time for more Nonny Chat. Goodbye.